What kind of man can build homes for the poor, shake hands in Congress, and still turn an entire nation into a battlefield? That is the contradiction at the heart of Pablo Escobar. Barret, this is not just the story of a drug lord. It is the story of how power grows in the cracks of a country, and how one man learned to live inside those cracks better than anyone else. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born in 1949, the son of a farmer and a schoolteacher. He did not come from privilege. He did not inherit power. He grew up in a Colombia marked by inequality, political violence, and limited opportunity. A place where legal success often looked slow, distant, and reserved for somebody else. By the time Escobar was a teenager, Medellin was changing fast. It was crowded, restless, ambitious. New money was appearing. Old rules were weakening. For a young man obsessed with status, control, and the image of success, it was the perfect environment. People who knew him in those early years often described the same qualities. He was persuasive, he was bold, he stayed calm under pressure, and most importantly, he made people feel that he already belonged above them. Before cocaine made him infamous, Escobar moved through the grey economy. Contraband, stolen goods, smuggling, small deals that taught him much bigger lessons. He learned how to build relationships, how to buy silence, how to spot weakness, and how to move goods through unofficial channels without attracting too much attention. That was the beginning. Not the empire, not yet. Mobile, but the mindset was already there. Because long before Pablo Escobar became rich, he understood something more important than money: branching systems. Barret, and soon, a new product would give him the chance to build one on a scale the world had never seen. In the 1970s, cocaine demand in the United States began to explode. And Pablo Escobar saw the future before most people understood its size. Abbas, others saw risk. Zapobar saw scale. Resisting. Democrats was not just another illegal product. It was portable, profitable, and moving into a market willing to pay extraordinary prices. The margins were staggering. The appetite was growing. And Colombia, with its geography, weak enforcement, and corruptible institutions, was positioned to become the center of a new criminal economy. Abbas moved quickly. He did not build power through chaos. He built it through structure. Pilots, drivers, accountants, guards, couriers, warehouse operators, local fixers, corrupt officials. Piece by piece, he assembled a machine. What later became known as the Medellin Cartel was not a corporation in the formal sense. It was a brutal alliance of interests, tied together by profit, fear, and personal loyalty. And Escobar understood all three. He also understood that power in Colombia was often cheaper to buy than to confront. Judges, police, customs agents, and politicians could be bribed, threatened, or removed. The phrase that came to define his world was simple and terrifying: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the money or face the consequences. As the money poured in, the scale became almost surreal. Cash was hidden in walls, buried in fields, packed into warehouses. Stories spread of fortunes so large that even loss became ordinary. Money damaged by moisture, forgotten in storage, eaten by rats. Some details became legend over time, but the central truth never changed. Escobar was becoming one of the richest criminals in modern history. And with wealth came spectacle. Luxury cars, aircraft, estates, private security. A lifestyle designed to project the message that he had already moved beyond the reach of ordinary law. But wealth alone was not enough for Escobar. He did not just want fear. He wanted admiration. He wanted loyalty. And eventually, he wanted legitimacy. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar was no longer simply a trafficker with enormous resources. He was becoming an image, carefully designed, carefully distributed, and incredibly effective. In poor neighborhoods around Medellin, the state had left deep absences. Housing was limited, recreation was scarce, public trust was weak. Escobar stepped into that vacuum with the instincts of both a populist and a strategist. He funded football fields. He supported community projects. He helped finance housing for families who had little reason to believe official institutions would ever help them. For many of those families, the aid felt real, immediate, personal, collaborated, mattered, because people do not judge power only by law. They judge it by what it delivers. This is how one of the most dangerous contradictions in Escobar's story took shape. To the state, he was a criminal empire. To some in neglected barrios, he was the man who got things done. The image was never the whole truth, but it was powerful enough to become a shield. At the same time, Escobar embraced spectacle on a grand scale. Hacienda Nápoles became a symbol of his excess, a vast estate filled with luxury, private entertainment, and exotic animals that made the place feel almost unreal. It was part fortress, part fantasy, part monument to the idea that ordinary limits no longer applied to him. But Escobar wanted something even more powerful than luxury. Registrated wanted recognition from the official world. He wanted the status that only institutions could provide. Compartments entered politics, presenting himself as a businessman with civic ambitions. He appeared in public, shook hands, smiled for cameras, and carefully shaped the image of a man ready to convert wealth into legitimacy. For a moment, it seemed to work. He gained a role connected to Colombia's Congress, and it looked as if he might pull off one of the most astonishing transformations in criminal history. But politics gave him something money could not fully control: visibility. And visibility brought scrutiny. Journalists began asking harder questions. Reformers began looking closer. And among the men most determined to expose him was Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla represented a threat that Pablo Escobar could not easily buy away. Hebi questioned the source of Escobar's wealth. He challenged the fiction that this was merely the rise of an unconventional businessman. And in doing so, he attacked the one thing Escobar valued almost as much as power itself: the mask. Escobar could not purchase legitimacy, then he would defend himself another way. Collage Lara Bonilla was assassinated. The killing shattered Escobar's political ambitions and forced Colombia to confront a darker truth. This was no longer just a story about corruption on the edges of society. A man deeply tied to a criminal empire had reached into the heart of public life and answered scrutiny with murder. From that point on, the conflict escalated, and one issue terrified Escobar more than almost anything else: extradition to the United States. Pawston in Colombia was one thing, extradition was another. It meant distance, loss of influence, and a justice system far less vulnerable to intimidation. Escobar understood that if extradition became normal, his empire would be living on borrowed time. Barrett he went to war against the idea itself. Comms tore through cities. Judges, police officers, journalists, politicians and civilians lived under constant threat. Public fear deepened. Institutions bent under pressure. The violence was not random, it was strategic. Terror became a tool of negotiation, a brutal message to the Colombian state that if it kept moving toward extradition, the cost would be paid in blood and fear. This is the part of Escobar's story that often gets flattened into myth. Disproportionate, but the reality was not cinematic glamour. It was trauma. Ordinary people paid for battles they never chose. Families listened to radios and wondered if their neighborhood would be next. Public servants went to work knowing they might not come home. A generation learned to live with uncertainty as part of daily life. Plotted and yet, even while Colombia was under pressure from the outside, Escobar continued trying to preserve another version of himself behind closed doors. Not the boss. Not the symbol. Barrett, the enemy of the state. But the family man. Inside his private world, Pablo Escobar tried to maintain the image of a provider, a husband, a father, a man who believed wealth could build security. Commissioners Maria Victoria when they were young, and together they had 2 children, Juan Pablo and Manuela. In photographs and family settings, there were moments that looked almost ordinary. Dinner tables, birthdays, quiet rooms inside large homes. A father trying to present himself as the center of stability. But there was no true separation between Escobar's family life and his criminal life. Collaborated, his choices made that impossible. The same fortune that provided luxury also brought surveillance, enemies, isolation, and fear. Homes became protected spaces. Gates became barriers. Convoys, guards, safe houses, sudden moves. This was not simply wealth. It was wealth under siege. Those closest to him lived between privilege and vulnerability, comfort and constant threat. And Escobar's world was growing more unstable from every direction. He rewarded loyalty generously, but he punished betrayal without mercy. That created obedience and deep paranoia. Rivals were rising, especially the Cali cartel, whose quieter and more discreet style contrasted sharply with Medellin's open violence. Within Escobar's own network, fear held people together, but fear also made every relationship temporary. In an empire built on intimidation, trust becomes fragile very quickly. Meanwhile, the state kept adapting. Pressure increased. Enemies multiplied. Elites wanted him gone. Rivals wanted him weakened. Investigators wanted him exposed. And ordinary Colombians wanted the fear to end. By the early 1990s, the situation had become so extreme that Colombia reached one of the strangest turning points in modern criminal history. Spotting Escobar negotiated a surrender. But even that was done on terms so unusual, so tailored to his interests, that it hardly resembled surrender in the traditional sense. For a brief moment, it looked as if Pablo Escobar had done the impossible again. He had turned defeat into another negotiation. And the place where that surreal chapter would unfold was called La Catedral. La Catedral was presented as a prison. But in practice, it became one of the clearest symbols of how far Pablo Escobar's influence could bend reality. In 1991, he agreed to surrender under extraordinary conditions, and the place where he was confined was built in a way that preserved comfort, distance, and control. It sat in the hills above Medellin, isolated and secure, but it was nothing like ordinary incarceration. Escobar received visitors, he maintained influence, and according to reports that emerged later, he continued directing elements of his organization from inside. For a moment, it seemed almost absurd. The man who had helped drive Colombia into a national crisis had once again arranged the situation to his own advantage. But the illusion did not last. Subsidiaries as evidence mounted that Escobar was still exercising power from La Catedral, authorities finally decided to move him to a more conventional prison. That was the moment the fragile arrangement collapsed. Before the transfer could happen, Escobar escaped. And with that escape, the hunt entered its final phase. The Colombian search bloc intensified operations. Intelligence improved, surveillance tightened. Safe houses were tracked, communications were monitored. US support helped sharpen the manhunt. At the same time, another shadowy force emerged, Los Pepes, a violent coalition of enemies, rivals, and avengers who targeted Escobar's network through retaliation and pressure. Now Colombia was caught in overlapping wars. The state against Escobar, Escobar against the state, rivals against Escobar, and private vengeance moving through the chaos. This was no longer the era of expansion. The grand image of the untouchable empire was beginning to crack. Escobar's world was shrinking. Movement became harder. Trust became rarer. Every phone call, every courier, every meeting carried risk. An empire built on growth had been forced into survival. Zappa survival is a different kind of power. It is smaller, more desperate. By the time the search tightened around Medellin, Pablo Escobar was no longer ruling an empire in the same way. He was hiding inside the ruins of one. As Pablo Escobar's empire narrowed, something else grew larger: the myth. Collaborated circulated constantly. Hidden tunnels, loyal neighborhoods, secret gifts, last-minute escapes, money still buried somewhere beyond reach. Some of those stories had roots in reality, others were exaggerations. But together, they helped transform Escobar from a fugitive into a legend. And legends have a way of outliving facts. That is one reason his story still fascinates people. Embarked from a distance, it can look cinematic. The rise, the fortune, the defiance, the spectacle. Bars, but close up, the reality was much uglier. Behind the legend were grieving families. Behind the headlines were compromised institutions. Behind the image of power was a country that had spent years absorbing fear into daily life. Escobar's story was never only about one criminal personality. It was also about the environment that made him possible. Inequality, corruption, weak trust in institutions, and the dangerous vacuum that appears when the state fails to deliver what people need. By late 1993, the manhunt was closing in with increasing precision. Investigators tracked communications more effectively. Safe spaces were disappearing. Escobar was more isolated than ever, relying on a shrinking circle of protection and increasingly exposed to surveillance. Then came December 2nd, 1993. One day after his 44th birthday, security forces moved in on a Medellin neighborhood after tracking a call. The pursuit ended on a rooftop. Escobar was killed in the operation, bringing one of the most notorious manhunts in modern history to a close. Even then, arguments and myths continued. Questions lingered. Competing versions of the final moment survived. But the larger fact did not change. Pablo Escobar was dead. Embarrassment for many Colombians, the news brought relief. For others, disbelief. For his family, it marked the beginning of another kind of struggle. Life after the man whose power had shaped everything around them. Yet death did not end Escobar's story, corroborated its form. Pollute, because now the battle was no longer over where he was. It was over what he would mean. After his death, Pablo Escobar became something even harder to control than he had been in life. Memory. Compartments people focused on the wealth, the audacity, the impossible scale of his excess. That is the most seductive version of the story, and also the most misleading. Abbas, the truer measure of Escobar's empire, is not found in estates, cash, or legend. Collaborated, it is found in the lives broken around him. In the judges, officers, journalists, and civilians who paid the price. Abbas in the families who learned to live with fear. Propagated during institutions that were exposed as vulnerable, corruptible, or absent when they were needed most. Escobar did not simply build a criminal empire. He revealed how much power can grow when a nation's fractures are left untreated. Why his story still matters. Not because it is glamorous, not because it is outrageous, but because it shows what happens when private power begins replacing public trust, and when a violent man can arrive disguised as a benefactor. In the end, Pablo Escobar did not just rule through money or terror, rule well inside the cracks. And Colombia had to pay the price for every one of them.